Story number 1.
The storm rolled in just after midnight, a monstrous wall of black clouds swallowing the sky. The first thunderclap hit so hard it rattled the windows of the old farmhouse, waking Claire from a restless sleep. She sat up in bed, disoriented, the distant rumble of thunder rolling through the valley like a warning. She had always hated storms. Ever since she was a child, they unsettled her. The flickering shadows, the howling wind, the deafening cracks of lightning. But this wasn't just any storm. There was something different about this one, something unnatural in the way the wind moved through the trees. Claire had been staying at the farmhouse for a few weeks, helping her aunt sort through her late grandmother's belongings. The house was isolated, sitting on a lonely stretch of land miles from the nearest neighbor. Her grandmother had lived there for nearly 50 years, alone for most of it after her husband had passed. Claire had always felt uneasy in the house, as if something unseen lurked in the corners, watching. She climbed out of bed and padded to the window. Rain lashed against the glass, the wind shrieking through the eaves. Lightning illuminated the yard for a brief second, and her breath caught in her throat. There was someone standing at the edge of the field, a tall, motionless figure, barely visible through the sheets of rain. Claire's stomach turned to ice. No one should be out there, not in this weather, not at this hour. She blinked, pressing her face closer to the glass, but another crack of lightning came and went, and the figure was gone. Just her imagination. That's what she told herself. The storm playing tricks on her. She turned away from the window and climbed back into bed, pulling the blankets up to her chin. But sleep didn't come. The rain continued its relentless assault on the house, and then, just as her body began to relax, she heard it. A knock. Not from the front door, not from the back, from the window. Claire froze. Her mind scrambled for an explanation. Maybe a tree branch had hit the glass, but the sound had been too deliberate, a slow, rhythmic knock. She held her breath, willing the noise to be in her head. Knock, knock. Louder this time. Claire squeezed her eyes shut. She was too afraid to look. The window was right next to her bed. If she turned her head, she would see it, see whatever was standing there. Then the power went out. Darkness swallowed the room, and the storm outside seemed to grow louder, angrier. Claire reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she fumbled to turn on the flashlight. Another knock, and then a whisper. Claire. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't possible. The voice, it was familiar. Too familiar. Her grandmother. No, it couldn't be. Her grandmother was gone. She had passed 3 months ago, right here in this house. Claire had been there when it happened, but the whisper came again, soft as the wind. Claire, let me in. Tears pricked at her eyes. She couldn't move. The air in the room had grown thick, heavy with something unseen. The storm raged outside, but inside an unnatural silence had settled. Lightning flashed, and for the briefest moment Claire saw it, a face pressed against the glass, pale, hollow-eyed. Her grandmother, but not her. Something wearing her face. Claire screamed and scrambled out of bed, her back hitting the opposite wall. She knocked over the lamp, the sound barely registering over the pounding rain. She fumbled for her phone, shining the light toward the window. Nothing. But the glass was fogged where the face had been. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She had to get out. She didn't care that it was storming. She would rather run barefoot through the rain than stay another second in that room. She bolted for the door, wrenching it open, but stopped dead in her tracks. Footsteps, not hers, coming from downstairs. Slow, deliberate. Someone was inside the house. Claire's breath came in short, panicked gasps. The front door was locked, the windows were shut, no one could have gotten in. Unless... She didn't let herself finish the thought. She backed away from the staircase, her mind racing. She needed to get out, but she had no weapon, no way of knowing what was down there. Then, the whisper came again, this time from inside the house. Claire. The voice was wrong. Stretched, twisted. Claire swallowed the rising scream in her throat. She turned, ran back into her room, and slammed the door. Her hands shook as she locked it, then pressed her back against the wood. Silence. Then, the knob turned. She choked on a sob. Something was on the other side. Something that wasn't her grandmother. The lock rattled. Then a loud bang as something slammed against the door. Claire whimpered, sinking to the floor. She clutched her phone to her chest, her thumb hovering over the call button. Who would she even call? The police? What would she tell them? that a ghost was trying to get into her room. Another bang. Harder this time. The wood splintered. Claire squeezed her eyes shut. She didn't want to see it. Then, silence. No more banging, no more rattling, just the storm outside. Minutes passed, maybe hours. She didn't know. When she finally found the courage to move, she reached for the doorknob with a shaking hand. She turned it slowly, inching the door open. The hallway was empty. Her breath came in quick, shallow gasps. She stepped out, her bare feet silent against the wooden floor. Something wasn't right. The air was wrong. Then she saw it. Downstairs at the bottom of the steps, a figure, standing in the darkness, facing her. Not her grandmother. Not anymore. It was tall. Too tall. Its limbs were wrong, stretched in unnatural ways. The face, her grandmother's face, was distorted, the mouth hanging open in a silent scream. Claire couldn't move. The thing took a step forward. Lightning flashed, illuminating the entire hallway, and in that split second, Claire saw them. More figures, standing in the corners, in the doorways, hanging from the ceiling, watching, waiting. The storm raged outside, but inside, everything was still. Claire took a step back, her legs trembling. The figure at the bottom of the stairs tilted its head, as if studying her. Then, in a voice that barely sounded human, "Let me in." Claire ran. She didn't stop to grab her things. She didn't stop to lock the door behind her. She ran into the storm, barefoot and shaking, the rain drenching her within seconds. She didn't stop until she reached the road, until the house was just a dark shape in the distance. When she looked back, lightning flashed one last time, and she saw them, standing in the windows, smiling. Claire never went back. She never spoke about that night. But every time a storm rolls in, when the wind howls and the rain beats against her windows, she swears she can still hear them. Whispering, waiting. Story, the end.
Story number 2.
The storm had been brewing all day. Thick, black clouds rolled across the sky, swallowing what little light remained. The air was thick and electric, pressing down on the small town of Hollow Creek like an unseen force. For as long as anyone could remember, Hollow Creek had been plagued by storms unlike any other. It wasn't just the intensity of the rain or the deafening thunder. It was something else, something darker. Every few years, a storm would come that left more than just fallen trees and flooded roads in its wake. People whispered about those nights, about those who had vanished, and about those who had seen things they refused to speak of afterward. Maggie and her husband Daniel had only recently moved into the old farmhouse at the edge of town. The house was sturdy, built long ago with thick wooden beams and brick walls that had weathered many storms. When they purchased it, the realtor had been unusually hesitant to talk about its history. "Just an old place," he had muttered, avoiding eye contact. "Solid bones." Now, as the wind howled and the first heavy drops of rain struck the window, Maggie stood by the sink, staring out at the field beyond the house. In the distance, she could see the remains of an old barn, half collapsed and overgrown with weeds. Something about it unsettled her. The first crack of thunder was so loud it rattled the dishes in the cabinets. She jumped, gripping the edge of the counter. Daniel, sitting at the kitchen table, glanced up from his book. "That was close," he said, setting his mug of tea down. "Might want to check the windows. Make sure everything's shut tight." Maggie nodded and moved through the house, pulling curtains closed and checking locks. The storm was growing worse by the minute. By the time she reached the second-floor hallway, the rain was hammering against the roof, and lightning flashed so frequently that the entire house pulsed with unnatural light. Then came the whispering. At first, she thought it was just the wind, gusts pushing through the cracks in the old wood, carrying the voices of the storm. But as she pressed her ear closer to the wall, her breath caught in her throat. The whispers were inside the house. Maggie turned slowly, her pulse quickening. The hallway was empty, but the feeling in the air had changed. The house, once warm and familiar, felt cold, alien. She moved toward the bedroom, her footsteps hesitant. She pushed open the door, expecting to see nothing but the neatly made bed and their few pieces of furniture. Instead, in the mirror above the dresser, she saw something that should not have been there. A reflection that was not her own. The woman in the glass was pale, her face gaunt and hollowed, with eyes black as the storm outside. Her lips barely moved, but Maggie could still hear the whispers growing louder surrounding her. "Get out!" the voice said, barely audible but insistent. "Get out before it comes." Maggie stumbled backward, crashing into the doorframe. The reflection did not disappear, it only grew more distinct. Then, with a deafening clap of thunder, the room went dark. "Maggie?" Daniel's voice called from downstairs. She turned and ran, nearly tripping over herself in her haste. The house felt like it was vibrating with energy, the storm outside merging with something unseen within its walls. "What's wrong?" Daniel asked as she reached the kitchen, breathless. She opened her mouth to speak, but before she could, the power went out. The room plunged into darkness, save for the sporadic flashes of lightning that cast strange, elongated shadows across the walls. Then came the sound, a deep, guttural growl reverberating through the floorboards. Daniel grabbed a flashlight from the counter and flicked it on. The beam wavered as he scanned the room. "Did you hear that?" he asked. Maggie nodded, gripping his arm. "There's something in the house," she whispered. The wind shrieked against the windows. The shutters rattled violently, and then footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from upstairs. Daniel tensed. "Stay here," he said. "No." Maggie grabbed his hand. "We need to leave, now." The footsteps grew louder. The air in the room grew suffocatingly thick. Maggie felt an overwhelming sense of dread settle over her, as if something ancient and malevolent had awakened within their home. Another flash of lightning illuminated the staircase, and for the briefest moment they saw it. A figure stood at the top of the stairs, shrouded in darkness. Its limbs were unnaturally long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its eyes gleamed, reflecting the storm's fury. Then the lights flickered back on. The figure was gone. Daniel swore under his breath, his face pale. "We're leaving," he said. Maggie didn't argue. They grabbed their car keys and rushed to the front door, but as Daniel turned the knob, a blast of wind forced it shut again. The house itself seemed to resist their escape. "Come on, damn it!" Daniel yanked at the door, but it refused to budge. A whisper echoed through the air, low, almost playful. "You can't leave," Maggie whimpered, pressing herself against the wall. "Daniel." He abandoned the door and grabbed her hand, pulling her toward the back exit. As they moved, the house groaned around them. Shadows lengthened unnaturally, stretching toward them like grasping fingers. The whispers turned to laughter, cold and mocking. The back door flung open before they even reached it. Without hesitation, they ran out into the storm. The rain was blinding, the wind nearly knocking them off their feet. They stumbled toward their car, barely able to see through the sheets of water pouring from the sky. As they reached the vehicle, Maggie dared one last glance back at the house. In the upstairs window, she saw the figure again, watching. And then the lightning struck. The bolt hit the roof with a deafening explosion, sending sparks raining down. The house seemed to shudder. Then, impossibly, the darkness within it expanded outward, swallowing the structure whole. Maggie screamed. The next thing she knew, she and Daniel were standing in the middle of an empty field. The house was gone. No wreckage, no foundation, nothing, just an empty patch of land where it had once stood. The storm ended moments later, as suddenly as it had begun. The clouds parted, revealing a sky that was eerily calm. They never found an explanation. The house had simply vanished, as if it had never existed. But sometimes, when the storms return to Hollow Creek, people swear they can still hear whispers in the wind, echoes of the house that once was, and the thing that had lived within it. Waiting. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The wind howled through the trees, rattling the old house as if it were trying to shake it from its foundation. Dark clouds churned above, swallowing the moonlight and casting the valley into an unnatural darkness. The storm had been building all evening, thickening the air with electricity, pressing down on the land like a great unseen weight. Ethan sat alone in his grandmother's farmhouse, watching the storm through the warped glass of the living room window. The old place was nestled at the edge of a dense forest, miles from the nearest town. He had come to settle some final affairs after his grandmother's passing, but he hadn't expected to stay this long. The house, with its dusty rooms and creaking floors, felt forgotten by time. The power had gone out an hour ago, leaving him in the dim glow of the fireplace. The storm raged outside, rain slamming against the roof, wind shrieking through the eaves. The thunder rolled again, deep and guttural, shaking the walls. And then, beneath the roar of the storm, Ethan heard something else. A knock. Faint. Distant. He froze, the hairs on his arms standing on end. No one should be out there. Not in this storm. Another knock, this time louder. It was coming from the front door. Ethan hesitated, his pulse pounding in his ears. The farmhouse was isolated, too far from the road for a lost traveler, too far from town for a neighbor to drop by unannounced. Knock. Knock. The sound was deliberate, measured. Not the random banging of a tree branch in the wind. Someone was there. He grabbed the flashlight from the table, clicked it on, and moved toward the door. His footsteps felt unnaturally loud on the wooden floor. He hesitated for a moment, then unlocked the bolt and pulled the door open. The wind blasted him with cold air and rain. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, searching. No one was there. The porch was empty. The rain lashed at the wooden steps, but there were no footprints, no signs of anyone having been there at all. Ethan's stomach twisted. He stepped back inside and locked the door, trying to push away the creeping sense of unease. He told himself it was just the storm, just his imagination. But then, he heard it again. Knock, knock, this time from the window. Ethan spun around, his breath catching in his throat. The flashlight beam wavered as he pointed it toward the living room window. The glass was fogged with condensation from the rain, but for a brief second, just a fraction of a moment, he thought he saw something on the other side. A shape. Tall. Motionless. Watching. A crack of lightning illuminated the yard, and in that flash, he saw it clearly. A figure stood just beyond the porch. Thin. Too tall. Limbs stretched unnaturally long, and its face, Ethan's stomach, turned to ice. The face was familiar. It was his grandmother, or something that looked like her. The skin was too pale, the features distorted, stretched in ways that didn't make sense. Her eyes were hollow, empty voids staring back at him through the glass. Lightning flashed again, and she was gone. The house fell deathly silent. Even the storm outside seemed to fade for a moment, as if the very air around him was holding its breath. Ethan's mind raced. His grandmother had passed months ago, in this very house. She had died peacefully in her sleep, at least that's what the coroner had said. But something inside him had never quite believed it. She had always spoken of the house as if it were alive, whispering about shadows in the corners, voices in the walls. Ethan had never put much stock in her stories. Until now. The silence was broken by another knock. From the back door. Ethan's chest tightened. He moved slowly, his flashlight beam trembling as he turned toward the kitchen. Another knock. And then a whisper. Ethan. His blood ran cold. The voice was wrong, warped. It carried the cadence of his grandmother's voice, but something about it was off. It wasn't human. The whisper came again, this time from just outside the door. Let me in. Ethan's breath hitched. He stepped backward, his pulse hammering in his ears. The storm outside roared again, wind howling through the trees like a chorus of voices. Then the doorknob rattled. Ethan clenched his jaw, forcing himself to move. He backed away from the door, heart pounding. He needed to get out. Then, another sound. Not from the door, from inside the house. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Moving down the hallway toward him. His stomach clenched. He hadn't heard the door open, hadn't heard anyone enter. And yet, something was in the house with him. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows across the walls. The storm outside shrieked, but inside the footsteps grew louder, closer. Ethan raised the flashlight, shining it down the hall, and that's when he saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the hallway. It was her, his grandmother, or whatever was pretending to be her. The thing tilted its head, watching him. The mouth was wrong, too wide, stretching into a grotesque smile. Ethan took a shaky step back. The figure moved. Not walked, moved. 1 second, it was at the end of the hallway. The next, it was closer. Unnaturally fast. Ethan turned and ran. He tore through the living room, grabbed his car keys from the table, and yanked the front door open. The storm hit him like a wall, but he didn't care. He sprinted to his truck, yanked the door open, and threw himself inside. His hands shook as he jammed the key into the ignition. The engine roared to life. Lightning flashed, and in the rearview mirror, she was there. Sitting in the back seat. Grinning. Ethan screamed. He slammed the truck into drive and tore down the muddy driveway, tires spinning in the wet earth. The house vanished into the storm behind him, but the feeling didn't leave. Something was still with him, even after he reached town. Even after he checked into a motel, locking the door behind him, heart still hammering in his chest. The storm faded by morning. The power returned. but Ethan never went back to the house. He sold it within a month. Never told the new owners about that night, but sometimes when he's alone on a stormy night, when the wind howls through the trees and the thunder rolls across the valley, he still hears the knock and the whisper, "Let me in." Story, the end.
Story number 4.
The first raindrops splattered against the windshield as James navigated the winding road through the dense forest. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth, and the sky above was an endless expanse of roiling black clouds. He turned on the wipers, but they barely made a difference against the increasing downpour. Beside him, his wife, Claire, stared out the window, her fingers tapping anxiously against her lap. "Are you sure this is the right way?" she asked, glancing at the GPS on her phone. James sighed. "Yeah, according to this, we should be there soon." The there she referred to was an old rental cabin deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. They had booked it for a quiet weekend retreat. No phones, no internet, just the two of them. After months of stress and tension in their marriage, they had hoped a getaway would help mend things. But as the storm intensified, Claire's unease grew. She hated thunderstorms, always had. Something about the way the sky split open with blinding light and the deep, rumbling growls of thunder made her feel small, insignificant, vulnerable. Another bolt of lightning slashed across the sky, illuminating the road ahead for a split second. James gripped the wheel tighter as he maneuvered around a sharp bend. The trees on either side swayed violently, their branches clawing at the sky. "There it is," James said, pointing ahead. Through the thick rain, Claire could make out the dark shape of the cabin. It was larger than she expected, its wooden structure appearing worn but sturdy. The headlights of the car cast long, eerie shadows over the front porch. James pulled up and killed the engine. For a moment, they sat in silence, the rain drumming against the roof. Then, with a deep breath, Claire reached for the door handle. The moment she stepped outside, the wind lashed against her skin, carrying a sharp chill. She pulled her coat tighter around her and followed James up the steps. The wooden planks creaked under their weight, and something about the sound sent a shiver down her spine. James fumbled with the key before finally unlocking the door. It swung open with a groan, revealing the dark interior. The air inside was stale, carrying the scent of aged wood and something else, something faintly metallic, like rust. Claire hesitated. "Come on," James said, already stepping inside. "It's fine." She swallowed her unease and followed. The moment she crossed the threshold, a powerful gust of wind slammed the door shut behind her with a force that made her jump. James chuckled. Just the wind. But Claire wasn't so sure. They explored the cabin quickly. There was a small living area with a fireplace, a kitchen with outdated appliances, and a single bedroom at the back. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, as if no one had stayed here in years. "I'll get the fireplace going," James said. "You okay?" Claire forced a smile. "Yeah, just tired." She wandered into the bedroom, setting her bag down near the old wooden dresser. The storm outside showed no sign of letting up, and each crash of thunder rattled the windows. That's when she heard it. A whisper. Soft, barely there, carried by the wind. Claire froze, her breath catching in her throat. She turned slowly, scanning the room. There was no one else here. "James?" she called out. "Yeah?" His voice came from the living room. She swallowed. "Did you say something?" There was a pause. Then, "No? Why?" Claire forced a laugh. No reason. She was imagining things. It was just the wind playing tricks on her. But as the night stretched on, the feeling of unease only grew. After dinner, they sat by the fireplace, sipping wine and listening to the storm rage outside. The flames flickered, casting shadows that danced across the walls. James seemed relaxed, but Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. "I don't think we're alone," she blurted out before she could stop herself. James raised an eyebrow. "What?" "I mean," she hesitated, "I feel like something's watching us." James sighed, setting his glass down. "Claire, it's just a storm. Old places make weird noises, that's all." But she wasn't convinced. And then, as if in response, a loud thud echoed from the bedroom. Claire jolted upright. "Did you hear that?" James frowned. "Yeah." They both stood, the firelight flickering wildly as the wind howled through the chimney. Slowly, James picked up the flashlight and headed toward the bedroom. Claire followed close behind. The door to the bedroom was open. The room itself was dark, James clicked on the flashlight and swept the beam across the space. Nothing. Then, another thud. This time, it came from above. Claire's eyes widened. The attic. James looked up at the ceiling. There was a small hatch near the center of the room, with a wooden pull-down ladder attached. Claire grabbed his arm. "Don't." James hesitated. He wasn't superstitious, but something about the air in the room had changed. It felt charged, like they weren't supposed to be here. But curiosity got the best of him. He reached up and pulled the string. The ladder unfolded with a creak, revealing a gaping darkness above. He climbed slowly, the flashlight beam cutting through the dust-filled air. As he poked his head into the attic, he swept the light around, and then he saw it. A chair, sitting in the middle of the attic, facing the hatch. And in that chair, a figure. James recoiled so fast he nearly lost his grip. The figure was motionless, draped in tattered clothing, its head tilted downward. The air around it felt thick, heavy, and then slowly it began to move. James scrambled down the ladder, nearly falling as he hit the floor. "Go! Get out!" he shouted. Claire didn't need to be told twice. They ran to the front door, but before they could reach it, the entire cabin seemed to shudder. The lights flickered violently, and the walls groaned as if something unseen was pressing in on them. Then the whispering returned. Only this time, it wasn't soft. It was loud, surrounding them. "Get out!" The front door flew open with an ear-splitting bang, and they didn't hesitate. They ran into the storm, the wind nearly knocking them off their feet. As they reached the car, Claire dared one last glance back at the cabin. Lightning illuminated the front window, and standing there, watching them, was the figure. Its hollow eyes burned into hers, its mouth moving soundlessly. Then, as the next bolt of lightning struck, the cabin went completely dark. They didn't wait to see what happened next. James fumbled with the keys, and the car roared to life. Tires spun in the mud as they sped down the winding road away from that cursed place. They never spoke about it again. They never told anyone. But Claire knew deep down that something had been in that cabin with them, and it had wanted them gone. Or worse, wanted them to stay. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The storm had rolled in suddenly, without warning. 1 minute, the sky had been clear, the air thick with the heat of late summer, and the next, the sky turned black, heavy clouds swirling with a kind of anger that seemed almost alive. The wind picked up, tearing at the trees, and the rain began, sharp and stinging, as though the heavens themselves had opened their floodgates. The roar of thunder echoed, shaking the windows, and the lightning flashed, briefly turning the night into day. It was the perfect night for staying inside, and that's exactly what Sarah had planned. She had been living in the small cottage at the edge of town for just a few weeks now, trying to escape the noise of the city and the ghosts of her past. The small, rustic house was perfect for her needs. It was quiet, remote, and for the most part, she was content. There were things about the house that unsettled her. Creaks in the floorboards, the occasional door that would swing open on its own, the strange drafts that swept through the rooms, but nothing that she couldn't ignore. At least, that's what she had told herself. On this particular night, as the storm raged outside, Sarah curled up on the couch with a cup of tea, wrapped in a thick blanket. She flicked on the television, but the storm was interfering with the signal, leaving the screen filled with static. She groaned, turned the TV off, and set the remote down. The only thing she could hear was the storm, the wind howling, the rain slamming against the windows, and the constant low rumble of thunder. It was a comforting sound in a way. It made her feel safe, as if the storm was a natural barrier, keeping everything at bay. It reminded her of her childhood, of rainy nights when she would fall asleep to the sounds of the weather, secure in the knowledge that the world outside would always return to normal by morning. But tonight the storm felt different. It felt as though it was pressing in on her. Sarah leaned back on the couch and closed her eyes, letting the storm lull her into a daze. But then, just as she was about to drift off, she heard it, a soft, scraping sound, like something dragging across the floor. Her eyes snapped open and she sat up, her heart pounding in her chest. The house was silent now, save for the storm outside. She stared into the darkness of the living room, her pulse quickening. Had she imagined it? It was probably just the wind, the house settling. But then the sound came again, a slow, deliberate scraping, It was coming from the hallway just outside the living room. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Her first instinct was to grab her phone and call someone, anyone, but her hands felt frozen. The air in the room felt thick and heavy, like it was pressing in on her from all sides. Her body felt as though it was made of stone, her muscles stiff and unwilling to obey. The scraping sound continued, this time followed by a low, guttural groan, almost like a voice, though too faint to make out the words. It seemed to be coming from just beyond the hallway, like something was in the house with her. Sarah stood up slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her. The storm outside seemed to have reached a crescendo, with the wind howling louder and the thunder crashing so violently that it felt like the entire house was shaking. She took a hesitant step toward the hallway, her senses on high alert, every nerve in her body screaming for her to turn and run. The scraping sound came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Someone, or something, was moving around in the hallway. Her heart raced and her mind went into overdrive, trying to make sense of what was happening. It could be an animal, she told herself. Maybe a raccoon or a possum had gotten inside somehow, but deep down she knew that wasn't the case. This wasn't an animal. She hesitated, listening intently, the silence of the house now deafening. Then, just as she was about to call out, the lights flickered. A loud crack of thunder followed, and the entire house went dark. She stood frozen in place, her eyes wide with fear, her breath shallow. The darkness seemed to close in around her, and the only sound she could hear now was her own heartbeat, thudding loudly in her ears. The footsteps started again, slow at first, then picking up speed. They were moving toward her. Sarah couldn't move, couldn't breathe. She wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. She wanted to scream, but no sound came. And then the sound stopped. Dead silence. The house was completely still. For a moment, Sarah thought maybe it was over. Maybe whatever had been making the noise had left. But then she heard it. The faintest whisper, like a voice just behind her ear, barely audible over the roar of the storm. Leave. It was a voice she didn't recognize, low and rasping, and it sent a chill through her body. The hair on the back of her neck stood up, and her skin prickled with the coldness of the voice. Leave, the voice repeated, this time louder and more urgent. Without thinking, Sarah ran. She darted toward the front door, her hands trembling as she reached for the doorknob, but when she tried to open it, it wouldn't budge. It was as if someone was holding it shut from the outside. She yanked harder, panic rising in her chest, but the door wouldn't open. It was locked, but she was sure she hadn't locked it when she came inside. She had left it unlocked, just in case she needed to make a quick exit. Her breath was coming in shallow gasps now, and she backed away from the door. The storm outside was now deafening, the wind screeching like a banshee, the rain pouring down in sheets. She felt trapped, suffocated by the storm and whatever else was in the house with her. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on, and Sarah's eyes darted around the room. The hallway was empty. The scraping sound had stopped. The footsteps had vanished, but the oppressive feeling of something watching her was still there, lingering in the air like a presence that would not leave. Then the temperature in the room dropped. She could see her breath in front of her, misting in the cold air. It wasn't just cold, it was bone-chilling, the kind of cold that seeped into your very soul. The door rattled. It wasn't just the wind this time. Something or someone was on the other side, trying to get in. Leave. The voice came again, this time clearer than before, and Sarah's heart nearly stopped in her chest. It was right behind her. She spun around, but there was no one there. No figure. No shadow. Just the cold air, the storm, and the oppressive silence. But then, in the far corner of the room, she saw it. The old rocking chair in the corner of the living room, the one she had noticed when she first moved in, began to rock slowly back and forth. At first, it was a slight movement, almost imperceptible, but then it picked up speed. The creaking of the chair grew louder, the rocking more violent, as though something was sitting in it, rocking with purpose. Sarah froze, her mind racing, her body trembling. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the chair. The thunder crashed again, and in the moment of silence that followed, she heard the whisper once more. Leave now. The chair stopped rocking, and the room fell into an eerie silence. She didn't need any more warnings. She turned and ran for the door again. this time throwing her shoulder against it, desperate to escape. The door slammed open with a sudden, deafening crash, and she stumbled out into the rain-soaked night. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The only thing that mattered now was getting away from the house, from whatever it was that had been calling to her, from the storm, from the dark, from the chair that still seemed to rock in her mind. She ran through the rain, not stopping until she reached the edge of the woods, her heart pounding in her chest. The storm had finally begun to abate, the wind dying down and the thunder growing faint, but the words that had haunted her still echoed in her mind. Leave. Sarah never returned to that cottage. The house, she later learned, had a long and troubled history, one that was linked to a family tragedy, a fire that had claimed the lives of the previous owners. No one had been able to live there for long, and most had abandoned the place after only a few nights, claiming it was cursed. Sarah had felt the truth of that curse in the storm that night. Story the end.